Aha! It's working. It was my mic plug. Now it's working, yes. All right. So I guess it's a little complex what I was trying to say and condense. It's a really simple process for me, but it's based on the way I think of things. So my question is about trying to get at what you mean by your rejection of fields or the idea that wave is an imaginary, there isn't waves in nature kind of comment. I understand in general, okay, and you could just give your own reasons, but what I've tried to do was explain where I'm coming from in my question, why it's hard to say. So I think first of all, there's two important concepts, or one important concept with two parts or whatever, about words. It's a philosophical distinction about the extension of a word and the intention, right? So the extension of coyotes is all the coyotes that are actually there or that you've seen. It's a set of examples. And then the intentional definition is more like the definition you would have in a dictionary or a science textbook, right? So with coyotes, you've got a bunch of examples in the extension. Oh, I've seen that animal. It looked like the other animal we saw. These are an animal. We're going to call it a coyote. Then in the intention, you have a description, right? Originally, it would have been morphological with this kind of coloring, this size, this sort of ears, fangs, description of it. That actually has flaws because, like, what if two coyotes give birth to a mutant coyote? It's just like a ball of fur, and its morphology is all wrong. So, more scientific over time, the extension of coyotes staying the same mostly. You could develop a genetic definition, right? And so, even if it was mutated, the morphology seemed wrong. Of course, it's kind of morphology, but it's at a molecular level, right? Now, since the extension exists, you keep changing your idea of how you would describe. And the intentional describe the animal, and that's its, or the thing, whatever it is, that's the intentional definition. And from a programming point of view, it's like a picking function. You should be able to have any random thing presented to you in the universe and be able to use this description to see, does that fit in this set? Right? So the intention is trying to pick things out to fit in the extension, and there's a tension between the two. So, for example, that mutant coyote in the morphology, maybe it's not a coyote, and you have to go, well, geez, then coyotes can give birth to something that's not a coyote. Or use the genetic definition, and it suddenly that is a coyote, and what it might change what is in the extension. But there's a back and forth, right? You're working on the intention from trying to get what you knew it when you saw it, trying to get um, that set represented. But once you get a really good intentional definition, you might find it changes what you think should go in that set. And I think this is a general process with words. Philosophy, certainly natural philosophy, which has something of a scientific approach, empiricism being a part of it. All right, so there's this concept. Now, the rest of the explanation, and remember, this is an explanation of how I think about things and why what you're saying when you say, oh, when you object to field so strongly, let me just put it that way, to the idea of field. So let's say we're back in time and we have two ideas about two physical phenomena, okay? And they're real examples, whatever, real enough. Okay, one of them is an idea of humors, this old folk idea that's been scientized, and you're in an era where there's this theory of phlogiston. If you've ever PH, you probably know what it is. Anyway, it's basically this idea of something going through your body that's responsible for your health and things like this, not unlike chi or something. But it was proposed scientifically, and they tried to find out if it exists. Right? The other example is the sunrise. There's the sunrise, and in that case, you believe what you received, and maybe you haven't thought about it that much, but that the sun is dragged across the sky by a chariot. All right. Now, the difference between these two examples of false theories is that sunrise, the extension of sunrise, is not in doubt. In the illusion of sunrise, which is really us, the Earth spinning around and we're coming out of the shadow of the Earth, that phenomena still exists. And so the extension full of things we call sunrises still exists. But the intentional definition of that moment when, you know, the God drives his chariot across the sky, that's the thing that's all messed up. So we end up doing away with that, and we use celestial or solar mechanics, whatever you want to call it. And we still use the word sunrise because, we got used to it, and extension is still there. Those things are still there. The problem was entirely in grasping a definition for what the phenomena really was, and then calling it something as a historical accident didn't even matter. Whereas phlogiston, it turns out the extension was empty. The intention to describe what it was is unimportant because there is no phlogiston. There's nothing in the real world. Now, some people might say, oh, it's the blood or something. No, because of the characteristics. But there's also that. We could be calling blood phlogiston now and have an historical accident. However, the distinction's still the same. In the case of phlogiston, there is no extension. So if you say phlogiston's imaginary, then that's the whole story. Okay, boom, let's not talk about that anymore. The intention, the extension, both gone. But saying there's no gods doesn't do anything to the extension of, hey, but there's a phenomena with these experiences we call sunrise. So in the case of fields, right, to me, the phenomena, you said it's like numbers over space, right? And even an empty space has coordinates potentially at each position. But even if there's not that, and that's just an artifice, the fact that there is space, meaning an object can be here or over here, means that there is a value at each point in space, whether it has an object in it or not. So like Gary's saying, if you don't need a field, if there's nothing permeating the field, this stuff about the oxygen and whatnot. But no, that's not true because there's space, and a field is an attempt to describe space in a scientifically, or rather a mathematically useful way, right? We have tools for dealing with the mathematical abstraction. Now, of course, no mathematical abstraction applies perfectly to reality, finding circles in reality and that sort of thing. But that's intentional definitions in this intentional versus extensional, right? It doesn't mean I intend to define it that way, though it's sort of related to that, what you intend to mean by the thing, but that's not really the etymology of the term. Those are all intentional things, and it doesn't affect the fact that there's space, right? So I'm saying it seems like you'd have to be objecting to some particular intentional definition of a field. Now, there are many such definitions potentially that could be objectionable in the ontological reality of it. But if we just use the one you used of space with values at locations in space, and that value is at the very least whether there's matter at that location or not. Though I guess that's arguable too. But I'm just trying to get at the idea of what I'm asking you, right? And I really feel it would already be clear, but I understand I have to explain it more. But hopefully you can follow. You got the intention, extension, boom. You got space, where no matter what happens to the intentional definition, it's like the rising sun. There is this phenomena of space. And then the final thing that wraps that together is I was talking about my epistemological framework is not that I'm going to go down and get a bunch of atoms and whatever the principles are at the axiomatic level and build my way back up to here. Then I'll know I exist, and then I'll build it up into a big picture and see the big picture too. No, I start from I exist, and all I have is information, right? So spatial phenomena is extensionally, it exists. And in science, we're trying to get good intentional definitions that describe what space is. Maybe there's more than one kind of space and this sort of thing, right? Like the idea of infinity actually is an example that's gone through this metamorphosis. I think it was Cantor proved there's different sizes of infinity. While everybody's common sense before, and in fact since, most common people don't think that way. There's just one kind of infinity. They don't really, they do think of it as a number and all that stuff. So he improved, for mathematicians at least, the intentional description of what infinity was, right? And saying, well, there's no such thing as infinity. Well, no, that would be a judgment about people with a certain intentional description of infinity and saying that it has to exist in a, like, there's an infinite, the universe is infinitely old or something. And that kind of infinity doesn't exist unless you change it to the fact that time's been expanding or whatever. You get into all of these details of what is a good description, and that's separate from you have a phenomena. So there is a phenomena of waves that we experience in this middle place as a human. Boom. We have reason to name that, just to identify it, give it a name. And then we're going to try to do better than that and get into the reasoning and see if we can make this picking function an intentional definition or description that describes the things that go in the extension. So the extension is spatial phenomena, locality, right? Separation, distance. Those are in the extension, and we're creating terms to identify them, and then we try to make intentional definitions. So it seems to me that, okay, in this framework that I have, you're rejecting some intentional definition of field, but I don't see how you'll get rid of the extension, the examples of fields, which is really just space when you need to spread numbers throughout the space, right? Whether the number is the mass at that location, whether the number is the gravitational field, whether the number is the amount of sunlight that lands at that part of your farm, whether it, you know what I mean, this phenomena has to exist. But I understand you're rejecting the ontological reality, is one way of putting it, of a particular conception or class of conceptions of field, and that's what you're objecting to. But to me, since the extension still exists, all you will really do in the end is a more important thing, which is to come up with a new, improved definition of field. So, for example, if Wolfram's right and there's some sort of cellular automata aspect to space itself and to physics, even if it's stretchable and relativistic and there's weird things about it still, um, then you'll be saying that there's discreteness in fields. And that might say, well, the math that we did in the past isn't as good as this new math we can do with the new model. And those are improvements I would welcome. But I'm curious about them for a couple reasons. One, because I don't understand how far it goes, or if you'll get my distinction here between an extension of things we consider spatial phenomena like locality or lack of locality, and an intentional description of what's in the universe in terms of fields. Right, I don't know how far uh, that will go, your rejection. And then also just because I don't think science really has offered, math has. In math, the field is what you said. But I don't think science has really committed to ontological definitions about fields the way where it's definite enough to reject, unless you want to just reject the confusion that they're showing. Because, I mean, they're talking about things like particles that make time happen and particles that create space. And, you know, time could be the interaction of particles, and we just decode it as time. And you know, it's kind of up in the air what these fields will be. The reason we need the concept, though, and is because there's phenomena distributed in space, right? And since there's phenomena distributed in space, we need a word for phenomena distributed in space, and then we're going to work on trying to characterize what phenomena in space is all about. So that's my second try. Cheers.